Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Art Windrum. Tonight's program is called Choosing How to Die. And there are three guys you're going to hear from tonight about making choices. I'm the first, but I'm not in the correct order, so to speak. But there's a reason I'm going first. In 2011, a guy named Peter Smedley, an Englishman with a degenerative neuron disease, decided that he didn't want to take that disease to its logical and absolute conclusion. And he traveled to Dignitas, a company in Switzerland where assisted dying is legal, and he availed himself of that service. An English writer named Terry Pratchett made a 1-hour documentary about that, and we'll be showing that after I'm done talking to you. And then here in 2014 in Denver, a friend of ours, Robert Mitton, is faced with a similar choice. And he will talk about what it's like to be faced with a choice here in Colorado in our time, where assisted dying is not yet legal. The film and Robert's story are extremely powerful. And because they are so powerful, we felt that it was appropriate to end on those notes and lead with what I have to say to you. But what I have to say to you is about our future choice. And Peter made his choice in 2011. Robert has to make a choice in 2014. And all of us will have to make a choice, hopefully, 15, 20, 30 years in the future. And the question is, what is going to guide us in making that choice? And that's what we'll talk about for the next half hour or so. So my part of the program is called Overcoming the 7 Deadly Obstacles to Dying in Peace. And it's the culmination of work that I started in 2004, and here's why I started it. These are my parents, Morton and Ruth Greenberg. Mom made it to 81 years of age, and Dad made it to 84 years of age. Medicine worked really, really well for most of their lives, but it completely failed them and the family at the end of their lives. In 2004, Mom suffered sudden respiratory collapse. It was complete. She was intubated in the ICU, that's placed on a machine ventilator. Within several minutes of her respiratory collapse, it was sudden. Nobody expected it. Everybody thought Dad would go first because he had a whole panoply of medical conditions, which we'll hear about in a moment. She lay comatose as the days became weeks. Her terminal hospitalization lasted about 3 weeks, which happens to be the national average for terminal hospitalizations in America. And finally, at the end of that time, we had no choice based on her non-responsiveness, but to quote-unquote pull the plug. 15 months later, Dad self-admitted for pacemaker eligibility testing. See, they had lived here in Colorado and retired to South Florida. And down there, after Mom died, and he more or less was done grieving her passing, he was interested in coming back out to finish his life here, but it's a mile high. And he had had 2 prior heart attacks and a range of other conditions. And in order to see if he could come back out here, the recommended treatment at that time was pacemaker eligibility testing, which required a heart stress test. He couldn't go on a treadmill, so that testing was chemical. And he did not fare well under that testing. In fact, he acquired what's called nosocomial, or hospital-caused MRSA, the superbug infection. And that infection precipitated his dying. And that hospitalization also played out in about, I'm going to need that, in about...
They need it upstairs.
Oh, they need it upstairs?
Just do without it and just set it down. Short mic stand.
Okay, go ahead, have it upstairs. Anyway, that hospitalization, that infection precipitated his death. And it also played out over about a 2.5-week period, again, the national average. Remember, these were 15 months apart from one another. I can't go into the details. I don't have the time tonight to go into the awful details about these hospitalizations, but they were rotten and crummy in every way, large and small, from beginning to end. And, you know, hospitals and medicine promise us care, but that is not what we felt, that's not what we experienced. What we experienced was characterized by a sense of absence. In our case, and ours, by the way, is my sister and myself, and each of my parents when they were alive, we experienced the absence of care. We actually were newbies. We were dying newbies. So we didn't know any better. We thought we were learning the ropes as we went, but we were actually mistaken. These experiences were characterized by the absence of things like communication, by disclosure, forecasting, guidance, monitoring, interest, and compassion. All these elements that together comprise what we commonly know of and experience as care. So these experiences activated me. And in retrospect, I came to call them the crucible, a place of severe test or trial where the heat is up and there's no escape. And I vowed several things at that time. The first was, never again. That with my remaining family, which is me and my wife and my sister and my daughter, I don't want to experience anything remotely like what we experienced during each of my own parents' terminal hospitalizations. The other thing I vowed was to get to the bottom of the failures. My own failures, my family's failures, medicine's failures, because we all say that we want to die in peace, as we did, and we were a small advanced plan family, we were cohesive, no friction, all the legal documents, and it didn't matter, ultimately, in how these events played out. So I wanted to get to the bottom of it, and I vowed that when I did, if what I learned when I got there was not already in the world, that I would do what I could to bring it forth. And I started then, and I continue now. It's going on a decade. I asked myself 3 questions then, and I posed them to all of us tonight, a decade later. Why do we fail to die in peace when we say that is what we want? Who owns your dying? That first question led pretty much directly to the second. And third, what does dying in peace actually require of us? That's me and of each of you. The first thing it requires is that we distinguish between dying at peace and dying in peace. By dying at peace, I define as our emotional and existential state at the moment that we die. And dying in peace has to do with our experience of a loved one's demise over its months, weeks, and days. And if the experiences that we have are shocking and harmful and destabling, then I propose, and I experienced, that we're not going to go out feeling peaceful if the months, weeks, and days leading up to our demise are not peaceful. So the question is, what can we do to make them so? Well, before we drill into that, let's take a step back a little bit and move away from the personal, right? Let's deal with the social. In America, 2.5 million of us die annually. 70% of us die in institutions. Now, most of us say that dying in peace means dying at home. I like to say with the dog licking my fingers. In Robert's case, it's the cat. 70% of us don't. By definition, that is 1.75 million Americans who are not dying in peace. And 20% of us die in the ICU, the intensive care unit, which is the antithesis of a peaceful environment. Now think about it for a moment. If each dying American has only one interested, concerned loved one, that's another 1.75 million people. So multiply it out by another 2, 3, 4 family members, and there's many, many millions of us every year, year in and year out, being affected in this way. And then multiply this across the industrialized world, because the problems that we encounter here in our country are exactly the same problems that other people throughout the Western world also experience. There are so many default circumstances that can put the kibosh on dying in peace that when we look at it from up high, from the 10,000-foot view, it really is an absurd quandary, isn't it? And it occurred to me one day that absurd quandaries could probably use an absurd explanation to help us get our arms around it. So here's one. You want to die at peace? Got to die in peace. All of one piece. Say, pretty please. Want to go in grace? With a neutral face. We're done this race. No. Got to stay in place. Beyond ready to depart. Jump jack your bones and shock your heart. And when you're picking at the air, No, bro, ma'am, you ain't going nowhere. There's an app for that. Never say die rap. Independent thinker. No one's rude. So, shove in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 twos. With C. diff, MRSA, gurgle, gurgle. And all we want to do is cuddle and snuggle. There's no app for that. Never say die rap. And in the annals of stupidity, death panels twist, are talking free, can't touch the sky. Theory seen, ain't living, ain't dying, don't mean to be mean. When death comes knocking, might walk, tick-tock, and hey, everybody, they use sex muck in a rap about that. Never say die rap. Now, it ain't just medicine in our way. If you don't talk, you don't get no say. Call 911 when it's time to pass. Blocking our own path, pain in our own ass. Take a number for that. Never say die rap. My friend Steve Price RN sings Dying is Dying. His songs are cool, and Steve ain't lying. Chart your life path while there's time to die in peace with minimal crying. Study up. Make some sense of 21st century impediments. Time to grow up before we get old. There's more to dying than we've been told. Wishing won't help us turn the page, so 16 new terms to engage. I have a matrix for that. Never say die rap. Never say die rap. Thank you. Now, in a way, we could end there, because the rap says it all, doesn't it? In an unbelievably compact way. It covers all the bases. But of course we won't, because we're going to drill into this a little bit. What I did as a result of my parents' terminal hospitalizations was to research and write a book called Notes from the Waiting Room, Managing a Loved One's End-of-Life Hospitalization. And through it, and through what it's become, Overcoming the 7 Deadly Obstacles, I provide a layperson's unique guidance about what it is that we really need to do if we want to die in peace. So it's morphed into this program over the decade. Now let's think about this for a minute. You've probably heard from medicine to fill out a living will, assign a proxy, and bring each of those things in tow at your moment of most need. The way I like to say it is when we burst through the double doors of an institution on a gurney. That's quite near the end. In fact, if a 3-week terminal hospitalization was expressed as part of an 80-year lifespan, and that 80-year lifespan was a 24-hour day, that moment of need would be the last minute of our 24-hour day. You think we can get it done in the last minute of a lifetime to figure it out under that kind of duress? I don't, and we couldn't. Now, on the other hand, spiritual guidance says to engage in contemplative practice, either formally through Buddhism or informally through contemplative work, saging, aging. Now, medical guidance is imperative. We must do those things. And spiritual guidance is, of course, very beneficial. But the thing is that neither of these, alone or together, do much, if anything, to help us identify, assess, mitigate, or even overcome the obstacles in our way to dying in peace. So we're going to identify those obstacles tonight, and identifying them is a first step in overcoming them. The first 5 are obstacles that I experienced during each of my parents' terminal hospitalizations. The last 2 obstacles are those that have occurred to me in the years since, and I've done some work to think through and develop. The first obstacle is failure to recognize prior medical engagement as heroic. I bet you've heard or asked yourself the question, or have had a loved one ask the family the question, when is enough enough? Right? And I wager that if we're asking that question and we're having a hard time answering it during a terminal hospitalization, that we really haven't asked it much before. Before, in my worldview now, means in the prior 5, 10, 15, even 20 years. For instance, my dad's period of medical heroism began in 1965 with his first heart attack out in Aurora, where I watched him get defibrillated. I'd had the electric paddles put on his chest. And he had another 19 years of very good life, and so did we. But in hindsight, as I tried to debug this, to answer these questions, why did we fail at the end of his life, I realized that his period of medical heroism actually started almost 2 decades earlier. So that's a real key question, and it's as up close and personal as you can get, and that's why it's the first obstacle. The second obstacle is exposure to medical misadventure. Snafus, actually. Misadventure is the first snafu. And it's exemplified here by a pacemaker, and that is about the size of a pacemaker. They're not really red, but that is to scale. And in my dad's case, he went in for pacemaker eligibility testing, and he succumbed to that, and then to MRSA. Had he not gone in, he probably would have lived several more years. It was ill-advised, and at the time, if you had one of these things implanted, medicine would not turn it off, even if you asked them directly. They have since changed their minds, but there's no guarantee that somebody wouldn't give you a little pushback on that. So implantable life support is an example of medical misadventure. Also, we're exposed to medical error, which is well known now to be the third leading cause of death in America, behind heart failure and cancer, and in front of every other medical cause of death. It's the equivalent of 2 jumbo jets worth of Americans dying day in and day out. And if the jets were actually falling out of the sky, you can bet we'd be hearing about it and doing something to fix that problem. The third deadly obstacle to dying in peace is ignorance regarding life support. And it is absolutely huge. I devote 30 some odd pages in my book to this topic because it's very, very gnarly and convoluted. And the reason is there are so many players. It has to do with overrides to our directives. And we don't know when those overrides are going to occur, generally, until they slap us upside the head in real time on the spur of some moment or other, and it's always the wrong moment, and it's always shocking and harmful when it occurs. We get personally confused, right? We may have prior resolve, but then we go plug somebody in anyway, and now having plugged them in, how can we, quote-unquote, unplug them? The Catholic Church, of course, has ethical and religious directives, and some Catholic hospitals are governed by them, and they come into play. The institutions themselves have overrides, and this is all wrapped up with surgical procedures and post-surgical procedures. Providers also have very different interpretations about their ethical requirements and what's appropriate in their behaviors and choices, and they may differ from ours. In my experience, over the crucible that I lived with, said none of this stuff was disclosed to us up front. And lastly, the state can override your advance directives, and Texas is the most recent example, if anyone heard about the elderly couple down there a month or 2 ago. The fourth obstacle to dying in peace is over-reliance on advance directives. Right? So medicine says fill out a living will, right? Sit around the dining room table. I call it signing and dining. And it's a good thing to do. But you know what? Living wills are only one of between 8 to 10 advance directives that only together comprise a loosely woven safety net under us. And depending on our age and condition, we might want all of them. And our tendency is to over-resolve, and this has been studied by psychologists, and doctors are aware of it too. And over-resolve when we create the directives and underperform or tend to bail a little bit when we actually need to apply them. The fifth obstacle to dying in peace is the inability to advocate medically. This is what we were faced with, and we thought we learned the ropes during Mom's hospitalization, and then we tried to apply some knowledge during Dad's hospitalization 15 months later, and we got bit by the same obstacles again. And it was after that that I really sat down and went through this process that's resulting in my ability to share this kind of thing with you. This is 1/3 of my medical library. And the first thing I will do the next time I have to function as a medical proxy is hit this shelf and pick off 2 or 3 books and take them with me as I'm running out the door. It's a huge endeavor to learn how to advocate medically and to actually do it. And it's simply the nature of the beast. So those are the 5 obstacles that I encountered over my weeks in the crucible. The next 2 are things that have occurred to me since. And you can see they're getting a little bigger and bigger and bigger. This one difficulty distinguishing among dying situations is something I'd like to drill into, because we haven't had the language to accurately talk about what's in front of us. See, mostly we say it's an either-or scene, right? Say, either I'm going to die at home, and we sort of picture the bucolic lakeside cabin or some lovely place, right? It's all peaceful. And if I don't make it there, I'm going to end up wired every which way in the ICU, as if those are the only two situations that are in front of us. But there are actually many more. So here's a metaphor. Imagine this. Imagine a world in which the many hundreds or thousands of flowers have no names whatsoever. And there's only one word with which we can discuss flowers. Flower. How could we state our preferences? How could we talk about the differences? It would be pretty much impossible, wouldn't it? So too, we have this one non-euphemistic word for dying, and it completely fails to map the territory in front of us. So I gave this a little thought. I determined that nobody had dealt with this. Nobody tried to solve this problem and pick it apart. So I did. And here's a very, very brief overview of it. When we're dying, there are two things that are important. How much time do we have, and who or what controls our dying experience? Right? That pretty much defines it. And the rest is detail. And of course, it's excruciating, personal, and quite important detail. But this is the shape that everything unfolds within. Where time and control intersect, I call it landings. As in, when the music stops, where are you going to land? Right? When the game's over, where are you going to land? And what I did was create Windrum's matrix of dying terms, which for the first time neutrally and accurately names all 16 situations. Now, this is not making life complicated. This is an expression of our lives in our medicalized age. And our lives are complicated because of these scenes. And what this matrix does is sort of untangle and debug that and give us language to discuss it. For tonight, the important landings are these two: released and postponed under personal control. And here's why they're important. Our focus, our container of tonight, is choice in dying. Personal choice in dying. Having the freedom to optionally say, I want to die tomorrow with medical assistance so that I don't suffer for another 3 months or a year. Right? And what's interesting to me, I've graded back all these other landings, maybe they look black on the screen, is that there are only 2 out of 16 dying situations that are considered by the mainstream to be unethical or are in fact illegal almost everywhere on this planet. And those 2 happen to be the only ones that potentially place dying under our direct personal control rather than some other entity's control. Really what this is about is providing us a tool to help us aim for the deaths we want and aim away from the deaths we don't want. And lastly, the 7th deadly obstacle to dying in peace is sort of a meta obstacle. It's the opaque dying marketplace. So when we're dying, end-of-life services are in fact transactions. People are professionals. They earn their living providing services to us. They are a given, because when we flip out of curative medicine, when we no longer can be cured, when we are dying, dying services will be provided. But a lot of doctors don't quite realize this or don't want to admit it and have difficulty integrating this sort of acceptance into their worldview. And that leads directly to the third point, that they are not described, they're not disclosed to us in advance. So imagine, another metaphor, imagine if every restaurant in this country had no name and no menu and a generic sign on the door. And if we're hungry, we just pick one, they all look the same, and we go inside, we sit down, we put a napkin on our lap, at which point we are on the hook for whatever is served, we must eat it, and we must pay for it. And that's pretty much how end-of-life services are provided to us right now. It's the water we swim in. It's the milieu. So, I presented these with these concentric circles as from the very personal to the sort of meta social level, but in actual fact, we experience these obstacles in an overlapping manner. Hence this multicolored representation based on the circles of life. Right? So those are the 7 deadly obstacles to dying in peace. Figuring out what to do about it is the subject of programs that I offer. I want to close with a little story about this. It's directly relevant to what we're going to see next. So my folks owned a Sir Speedy print shop at Colfax and Ivanhoe back in the mid-'70s, and I worked there for 5 years, and my sister worked there too. One day, Dad walked in with a box of yellow buttons that he had made up, and he put the box on the counter, and every time a customer came in the door, he would grab a button, walk out into the lobby to greet them, hand them the button, and ask them a completely irreverent question, which he could not get away with today. I looked on in shock, and when people were particularly attractive, in jealousy. I was young. You might get the idea that in order to do what I've done over the last 10 years, I have to ask a lot of questions. And among them was, I wonder what the folks would think of what I do and what I say today. I think my mom would say, man, just ditch that rap. I think my dad would say, I had no idea that I bequeathed you that crazy question that I used to ask in a different time, in a different place. I think if Dad could, he would amble out here with his walker and that grin, and he would reach into his pocket and back 38 years, and he'd hold out the button, and he'd pop you the question. Would you like a quickie? Would you like a quickie? Well, we're going to repurpose that question tonight. And here it is. Is protracted dying the necessary cost of extended living? What Peter Smedley wanted for himself was a quick exit. What Robert is contemplating for himself is a quick exit, right? Different places, though. It was legal in Switzerland. It's not legal in Colorado. So, you want to die at peace? Got to die in peace. The 20th century poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, started one of the sonnets to Orpheus with this beautiful sentence: be ahead of all parting. Be ahead of all parting. And that's what we have to do. In contemplating all these obstacles and learning how to overcome them, in lobbying for choice here in Colorado, in exercising choice should we get it, what we're trying to do is be ahead of all parting.